Chapter 13. My kingdom is of this world. Joseph Smith just missed being a very handsome man. His nose, peaked and protuberant, was not too attractive in profile, but visitors and converts alike described his eyes as astonishingly beautiful and his smile as ingratiating and infectious. Although the paleness of his face seemed to belie his youth and health, the effect was startling rather than unpleasant. He had remarkable presence, his size and bearing dominating every gathering into which he walked. Added to this was a cordiality that disarmed all but his bitterest foes. Joseph shook hands with all the world, said one convert. The people fairly adored him. It was inevitable that a man with so much physical charm should become a target of gossips. As we have seen, his name was linked with Nancy Miranda Johnson's as early as 1832. Then sometime in 1835 it began to be whispered about that he had seduced a 17-year-old orphan girl whom Emma had taken into the family. This was Fanny Alger, who Benjamin Johnson described in later years as a very nice and comely young woman about my own age, toward whom not only myself but everyone seemed partial for the amiability of her character. It was whispered even then, Johnson said, that Joseph loved her. The Prophet's grammar teacher, C.G. Webb, told one writer that this girl was unable to conceal the consequences of her own celestial relation with the Prophet, and that Emma drove her out of the house. Whether or not Fanny Alger bore Joseph a child, it is clear that the breath of scandal was hot upon his neck. Warren Parrish, who for a time was Joseph's secretary, told young Benjamin Johnson that he and Oliver Cowdery knew the report of an illicit affair between the girl and the Prophet to be true, for they were spied upon and found together. Cowdery made no secret of his indignation, and Joseph finally called him in and accused him of perpetuating the scandal. We had some conversation, Cowdery wrote to his brother, in which, in every instance, I did not fail to affirm that what I had said was strictly true. A dirty, nasty, filthy affair of his and Fanny Alger's was talked over, in which I strictly declared that I had never deserted from the truth in the matter, and as I supposed, was admitted by myself. The most that Joseph could wring from Oliver was an admission that he had never heard the Prophet acknowledge his guilt, and Joseph had to be content with publishing in the Elder's Journal of July 1838 the sworn statements from 3 witnesses that Cowdery had made this admission. Cowdery himself stoutly refused to exonerate the Prophet, and was eventually excommunicated from the church for several misdemeanors, among them insinuating that the Prophet had been guilty of adultery. Fanny moved on to Indiana, where she married and reared a large family. When in later years polygamy had become an accepted pattern in Mormon life, Joseph's leading elders looked back at the Kirtland days and concluded that Fanny Alger had been the Prophet's first plural wife. But when they questioned her about her relationship with Joseph, she replied, "That is all a matter of my own, and I have nothing to communicate." In 1835, however, it seemed to those who knew of it to be an unfortunate infatuation. The scandal was insufferable to Emma, who was passionately fond and jealous of her husband. She had, moreover, a keen sense of the propriety and dignity of his office, and must have been humiliated for the church itself, which was beginning to attain stature and some degree of stability. There is no record of her anger except in the dubious gossip of neighbors that crept into print after a half-century. Joseph almost never mentioned Emma in his journals, and apparently at this time did not confide his domestic troubles to his friends. But in November 1835 he made a public statement, part of which by its strange emphasis would seem to indicate that his domestic life was far from tranquil. "Wives, submit yourself to your husbands, and as unto the Lord, for the husband is the head of the church, the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Wives, submit yourself unto your own husbands, as it is fit with the Lord." There were other reasons, less provocative perhaps than the winsome servant girl, why Joseph was beginning to reflect seriously, and therefore imaginatively, upon the whole institution of marriage. The Geauga County Court had forbidden Mormon elders to perform the marriage ceremony on the ground that they were not regularly ordained ministers. Rigdon had retained the right, but only by proving in court that he was still registered as a minister of the disciples of Christ. The restriction was an intolerable insult to Joseph, who was thereby denied a right exercised by the lowliest circuit rider. Moreover, Kirtland was full of converts who had left behind them spouses who could not be persuaded to join the church. Since divorce was always difficult and often impossible to obtain, a critical social problem developed. Martin Harris had been brought to trial for adultery as early as 1832, but such trials clearly were not the remedy for the growing evil. One convert, who had left a vixenish spouse in New York State, told Ezra Booth on the first trip to Missouri that Joseph had given him leave to take a wife from among the Lamanites. But marriage with the Indians was hardly a satisfactory solution in any case, and was scarcely to be suggested to women who had left their husbands for the cause of the Prophet. There was Lydia Goldthwaite Bailey, a convert of great charm, whose husband refused either to follow her to Kirtland or to grant her a divorce. Newell Knight, now a widower, fell in love with her, and there were few men for whom Joseph had so deep an affection. Newell, a trusted friend, gentle and generous, became so despairing over the hopelessness of his lot that Joseph was sorely tempted to defy the law in his favor. Finally, on November 23, 1835, he married them in a simple ceremony in the Knight home. In his manuscript journal, Knight related how Joseph told his congregation that he had married brother Newell Knight to Lydia Bailey, or Goldthwaite, properly, although the laws of Ohio had not yet granted him the right to marry. But, said he, I have done it by the authority of the holy priesthood, and the Gentile law has no power to call me to account for it. It is my religious privilege, and even the Congress of the United States has no power to make a law that would abridge the rights of my religion. Joseph's preoccupation with the marital difficulties prevalent in Kirtland, including his own, coincided in time with his writing of the Book of Abraham, and he obviously emerged from his intensive study of Genesis with considerable detachment concerning the holiness of monogamy. Newell Knight confided in his journal that at his wedding feast Joseph said many things relative to marriages anciently, which were yet to be revealed. And before long, in that mysterious fashion by which extramarital relationships became known and chronicled in the unwritten history of a small town, Kirtland began to be associated with the word polygamy. It is hardly likely that this charge could have had its basis in an occasional extra-legal marriage ceremony like that of Newell Knight. Several men, Orson Pratt among them, insisted in later years that Joseph was actually teaching the principle of polygamy at this early date, but their statements were made about a half-century later. Footnote: Joseph F. Smith, Jr., the present historian of the Utah Church, at the time of the writing of the book, asserted to me in 1943 that a revelation foreshadowing polygamy had been written in 1831, but that it had never been published. In conformity with the church policy, however, he would not permit the manuscript, which he acknowledged to be in the possession of the church library, to be examined. Orson Pratt's statement was made in a speech at Plano, Illinois, September 12, 1878, where he reported that the apostle Lyman Johnson had told him that Joseph had made known unto him as early as 1831 that plural marriage was a correct principle. The prophet's nephew, Joseph F. Smith, stated in a letter to his son, the revelation was given as far back as 1834, and it was first reduced to writing in 1843. The reorganized church in Missouri, founded by the prophet's son, stoutly insists that Joseph Smith never practiced or taught polygamy, but the evidence against this stand is overwhelming. But their statements were made about a half-century later. There were many contemporaneous intimations of matrimonial informalities in Kirtland, but no mention of a revelation on the subject. John Whitmer wrote that in 1836 the church leaders lusted after the forbidden things of God, such as covetousness and in secret combinations, spiritual wife doctrine, that is, plurality of wives. Oliver Olney held that an unlawful intercourse amongst the two sexes existed, of which testimony plainly spoke, and said further that it was whispered among the same marriage system practiced in the days of Solomon and David would eventually prevail again. In August 1835, the church issued the first of a series of official denials of the charge of polygamy. This was a resolution adopted at the church conference. Inasmuch as this church has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife, and one woman but one husband, except in case of death, when either it is at liberty to marry again. Since Joseph was in Michigan when this resolution was adopted by the church, and since it was written in Cowdery's hand and introduced by him to the conference, there is a possibility that Joseph would not have approved it. However, it may be observed that the wording of the resolution was such that it did not strictly forbid a man's having more wives than one. The construction, one man but one husband, was not paralleled in one man should have one wife. When an anonymous article advocating polygamy as a means of ending prostitution and spinsterhood appeared on February 4, 1837 in the Cleveland Liberalist, a paper widely read in Kirtland, the gossips buzzed again, and the priesthood was stirred to new action. The Quorum of the 70s passed a resolution denying fellowship to any member guilty of polygamy, and the Elders' Quorum brought to trial at least one member, Solomon Freeman, for living with another woman, though he had a wife in Massachusetts. Freeman nonplussed the elders by vowing that he would not cross the room to get a writ of divorce from his first wife. Distortion of the marriage code and experimentation with sexual relationships was common in these years among minor religious sects. On the one extreme example were the Shakers, the Harmonists, and the followers of Jemima Wilkinson, who practiced celibacy. On the other were the perfectionist societies led by Simon Lovett and John Humphrey Noyes, which indulged in free love. Lovett began preaching the doctrine of spiritual wifehood in New England in 1835, the same year that he heard the first whispers of polygamy among the Mormons. Noyes, who later founded the famous free love community at Oneida, New York, wrote to a friend in 1836, "The marriage supper of the Lamb is a feast at which every dish is free to every guest. In a holy community there is no more reason why sexual intercourse should be restrained by law than why eating and drinking should be. The guests of the marriage supper may each have his favorite dish, each a dish of his own procuring, and that without the jealousy of exclusiveness. I call a certain woman in my life, she is yours, she is Christ's, and in him she is the bride of all saints. She is dear in the hands of a stranger, and according to my promise to her I rejoice." When the scandal-hungry editor of the Philadelphia Battle Axe published this, the whole nation shuddered with pleasurable horror. Rumors of polygamy among the Mormons were not loud, but they were persistent. While there is no irrefutable evidence that it was actually practiced at this time, despite some highly irregular marriages and the Fanny Alger scandal, there was talk of it, talk that increased with the passing years, and it can hardly have been baseless, since the Mormon Church was soon to avow and become notorious for this aberration, so extraordinary in the milieu of Puritan America. Whatever breach had opened up between Joseph and Emma was apparently quickly closed. No hint of it crept into his journal, but this absence may suggest freedom from frustration as much as a sense of decorum. A man of Joseph's physical charm scarcely needed to retire to his journal to relieve vague longings, nor indeed did he need to suffer them. Kirtland was overflowing with women who idolized him. Eliza Snow, gifted poetess and daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Mantua, had joined the Mormons and become mistress of a school in Kirtland. She boarded at the prophet's home, and it soon became common gossip among the non-Mormons that she was infatuated with Smith. Back in February 1831, Joseph had written a revelation that said, "Thou shalt love thy wife with all thy heart, and thou shalt cleave unto her and none else." If in 1835, after 8 years of marriage to a woman somewhat his senior, Joseph began to yearn for variety and adventure, he must soon have realized that for a prophet it is easier to change marriage laws than to contravene them. Since the wrong was but a wrong in the world, and the world lay in his hand, he might easily make it right. The paradise of the prophet had much of the earth in it. Joseph had the poor man's awe of gold, and it crept into his concept of heaven. When God would descend to the holy city, he said, paraphrasing Isaac, "For brass he will bring gold, and for iron he will bring silver, and for wood brass, and for stones iron, and the feast of fat things will be given to the just." And when the lost tribes of Israel streamed forth at last from the north countries to join the saints, they too would be laden with jewels and gold. "It passes for a current fact," wrote Ezra Booth late in 1831, "that there are immense treasures in the earth, especially in those places in the state of New York from whence many of the Mormonites emigrated last spring, and when they became sufficiently purified, these treasures are to be poured into the lap of their church. To use their own language, they are to be the richest people in the world." Mormon theology was never burdened with otherworldliness, and there was a fine robustness about it that smelled of the frontier and that rejected an asceticism that was never endemic to America. The poverty, sacrifice, and suffering that dogged the saints resulted largely from classes with their neighbors over social and economic issues. Though they may have gloried in their adversity, they certainly did not invite it. Wealth and power they considered basic among the blessings of both of earth and of heaven, and if they were to be denied them in this life, then they must assuredly enjoy them in the next. It seemed for a time during the late 30s that heaven was practically at Kirtland's gates. The city, according to the Mormon press, was all activity, all animation. The noise and bustle of the teams with lumber, brick, stone, lime, or merchandise were heard from the early dawn of morning till the gray twilight or evening. The sound of the mechanic's hammer saluted the ear of the sluggard before the rising sun had fairly dispelled the sable shades of light, and the starting up, as if by magic, of buildings in every direction around us were evidence to us of buoyant hope, lively anticipation, and a firm confidence that our days of pinching adversity had passed by, and that the set of time of the Lord to favor Zion had come. Kirtland actually was in the throes of the maddest speculative craze in the nation's history. Land prices all over the West were spiraling at a fantastic rate. Lots bought in Buffalo for $500 an acre in 1835 were in 1836 being sold and resold in parcels until they were going at $40 a foot or $10,000 an acre. Land prices over the whole of Ohio were higher than they were to be for another 70 years. Along the south shore of Lake Erie, from Buffalo past Kirtland to Cleveland, cities were platted at every indentation on the coast, the speculators predicting one solid city along the whole 200-mile distance. The great influx of immigration into Ohio, which caused her population to leap 62% in the 30s as compared to a national rise of 32%, particularly aggravated the land boom in that state. Credit was easy. Land banks were flooded with paper money shortly to prove worthless. Within Kirtland itself, lots jumped for $50 to $2,000, and surrounding farms from $10 and $15 an acre to $150. Real estate rose from 1 to 800%, and in many cases more, said the editor of the Messenger and Advocate. Men who were not thought worth $50 or $100 became purchasers to the amount of thousands, notes, some cash, deeds, and mortgages passed and repassed till all, or nearly all, vainly supposed they had become wealthy. No less than his saints, the prophet was infected with this virus of speculation. He began buying and selling land with the extravagant abandon that infused the whole West. His grammar teacher reported that he frequently played auctioneer, and a very good auctioneer he was. The saints were full of enthusiasm, and lots went up from $100 to $3,000 and $4,000. Such activity did not seem indecorous to either to Joseph or his people, who by now had become accustomed to his eager participation in secular affairs as well as tutelage in things of the Spirit. The whole church identified prosperity with the goodness of God. Occasionally, Joseph met opposition to his real estate transactions. When he tried to purchase the farm of Isaac McWithy for $3,000, suggesting a down payment of $400 or $500 to take him to Zion and settle him there, and an obligation for the remainder with good security and interest, McWithy, who had little taste for the Missouri wilderness, refused the offer and was brought to trial before the High Council for insolence, but such cases were rare. Joseph's credit was good. His imposing temple, which had cost between $60,000 and $70,000, was deemed excellent security, despite the $13,000 debt hanging over it, and a big steam mill in which he had invested thousands of dollars was expected soon to begin making money. He borrowed everywhere, in sums ranging from $350 loan from the Painesville Bank to a 6-month credit for goods in Cleveland and Buffalo amounting to $30,000. On July 11, 1836, Andrew Jackson issued his specie circular for forbidding agents to accept anything but gold and silver for the sale of public land. Its purpose was merely to dam the flood of depreciated bank paper that was pouring into the United States Treasury, but the deflationary trend that had started moved swiftly into the Great Panic of 1837. The Mormons for a time survived the impact of the specie circular in Kirtland, but in Missouri it spelled trouble. The sale of public land on the whole frontier dropped from $25 million in 1836 to less than $7 million in 1837. The Mormons in Missouri, like everyone else on the border, had been buying public land on credit. Credit now was denied them. To make matters worse, the old settlers in Clay County, with whom the Saints had taken temporary refuge after being expelled from Jackson County, were becoming impatient for them to move on. The sinister mutterings that the Mormons had come to dread in Jackson County now began to spread through Clay as one by one the anti-Mormon accusations were revived. Joseph seriously considered moving the whole colony to Wisconsin, where the troubles that invariably overtook the Mormons would not be aggravated by the slavery question, but he finally decided that it was easier to settle them in the still uninhabited prairie counties of upper Missouri. He ordered W. W. Phelps to explore the area, and in March 1836 sent Partridge, Morley, and Corral to Missouri with $1,450 to purchase new sites. Since most of the upper Missouri was government land, these men were caught in the specie circular before they could use much of the currency entrusted to them. The Missouri Saints themselves were desperately poor. Phelps wrote back to Kirtland a description of northern Missouri which reflected his melancholy. "Here sickness comes, and where does it not? The ague and fever, the chill fever, a kind of cold plague, and other diseases prey upon emigrants until they are thoroughly seasoned to the climate. Here death puts an end to life, and so it does all over the globe. Here the poor have to labor to procure a living, and so they do anywhere else. Here the saints suffer trials and tribulations, while the wicked enjoy the world and rejoice, and so it has been since Cain built a city for the ungodly to revel in. But it is all right, and I thank God that it is so. The wicked enjoy this world, and the saints the next." The pressure from the Clay County settlers became more and more insistent. At a general meeting on June 29, 1836, they publicly invited the sect to move. We therefore, in a spirit of frank and friendly kindness, read the resolution in part, do advise them to seek a home where they may obtain large and separate bodies of land and have a community of their own. We request them to leave us when their crops are gathered, their business settled, and they have made every suitable preparation to move. A new appeal from the Mormon leaders to Governor Dunklin met with frigid reception. The time was, Dunklin wrote, when the people, except those in Jackson County, were divided, and the major part in your favor. That does not now seem to be the case. Your neighbors accuse your people of holding illicit communication with the Indians and of being opposed to slavery. You deny. Whether the charges of the denial is true, I cannot tell. The fact exists, and your neighbors seem to believe it is true, and whether true or false, the consequences will be the same if your opponents are not merely gasconading. Unless you can, by your conduct and arguments, convince them of your innocence. If you cannot do this, all I can say to you is that in this republic, the vox populi is the vox dei. The Missouri Saints were now in a dismal predicament. Bewildered and bitter, they remembered that their prophet had appointed September 11, 1836, as the date for the redemption of Zion. But as the day approached, they saw before them not a triumphal entry into the New Jerusalem, but a miserable northward trek to the dreaded prairies, where there was said to be neither timber nor water in sufficient quantity. Most of them accepted their lot without protest, however, confident that the millennium could not be far distant. Then, they said, the righteous will feed themselves on the finest of wheat. Then, for brass the Lord will bring gold, and for iron silver, and wood brass, and then the land will be worth possessing and the world fit to live in. Joseph felt keenly the plight of his Missouri colony. Specimens must somehow be collected and sent to them in quantities sufficient for down payments on new land, but he was also in desperate need of money to settle many Kirtland debts. In September he would have to pay Charles Holmes the $10,000 he had borrowed in 1831 to the ill-fated United Order in Motion. The $30,000 credit he had obtained in the spring must be met in November, and along with a host of lesser debts, there was the sum of $13,000 still owing on the temple. The desire for money in gold and silver became almost an obsession with him. With the need to be so critical, he began to lend a serious ear to a story that had appeared in the Painesville Telegraph concerning a vast treasure buried beneath an old house in Salem, Massachusetts. Salem was the magic city of Joseph's childhood, the place where he had first tasted the exciting world outside his spare Vermont village. The lure of the old port swept over him now and helped to crystallize his impulse to try his luck at finding the buried gold. A convert named Burgess claimed to know the exact location of the house and offered to lead Joseph to the spot. It was a child's dream. For all his acumen, there was something very simple in Joseph's approach to his complicated difficulties. He clung to the daydreams of his youth, seeking their fulfillment in such singleness of purpose and childlike faith that he was bound on occasion to be spectacularly successful. Although it had been almost 10 years since he had looked for buried gold, the old eager optimism now came back with an irresistible force. He could not, however, help sensing the unseemliness of a treasure hunt on the part of the Lord's anointed, and while this feeling did not deter him, it did serve to make him secretive of his intentions. When he went east with Rigdon, Cowdery, and Hiram Smith, it was ostensibly on a missionary tour. When they arrived in Salem early in August 1336, he was faced with an awkward task of explaining his true objective. Rarely in these years did he speak in the Lord's name, but this was an occasion that required it. I, the Lord your God, said the message, am not displeased with your coming on this journey, notwithstanding your follies. I have given much treasure in this city for you, for the benefit of Zion. I will give this city into your hands, that you shall have the power over it, insomuch that they shall not discover your secret parts, and its wealth pertaining to gold and silver shall be yours. Concern not yourselves about your debts, for I will give you the power to pay them. And inquire diligently concerning the more ancient inhabitants and founders of this city, for there are more treasures than one for you in this city. Therefore be ye wise as serpents, and yet without sin. For more than a month he made surreptitious inquiries and tracked down clues. Sometime into September he returned to Kirtland, as barren of treasure as he had ever been. The true nature of the trip could no longer be kept secret, and his followers shook their heads in sorrow and disbelief. We speak of these things with regret, wrote Ebenezer Robinson in 1889 in describing the episode. Joseph made no apology for this indiscretion. In his history, he described the trip to Salem as an ordinary missionary tour, and the incident eventually was forgotten. Probably none of his followers were aware that a chapter in Joseph's life had been brought, somewhat belatedly, to a close.